So I'd like to begin just by giving a very warm welcome to everyone to our session here today on insights and qualitative research methods, this very special webinar series that we're really happy to be holding and to have this opportunity to connect with all of you. My name is Ivana Radovojevic, and I'm the project manager with Atlas TI. And I'm very pleased to be here today with all of you and to introduce this webinar series that's organized by the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and sponsored by Atlas TI, the software for qualitative data analysis. So the objective of this webinar series is to offer insights into innovative approaches and practices in qualitative data analysis with Atlas TI, as well as qualitative methods more broadly. And we really believe that sponsoring this initiative can help to reach people all around the world and democratize knowledge and help researchers by providing these sessions for free. Now, I also want to express my great gratitude to Professor Emerita Karen Olson, who came to us several years ago with a brilliant idea to launch this project. And well, without any further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to our leader of the International Qualitative Research Toolkit, Professor Olson.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Olson, and I'm based at the International Qualitative Research Toolkit at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. I respectfully acknowledge the Sea Okanagan Nation and their peoples, in whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Sally Thorne. Dr. Thorne is a professor at the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia. She has a long-standing research program in the field of patient experience and relational practice in chronic illness, cancer, and end of life, in addition to a substantive body of scholarly work in the philosophy of science, the nature of evidence, and applied qualitative methodology. She is also the author of 4 books, including the popular qualitative research text on interpretive description, a method she first wrote about in 1997 and has continued to develop. Dr. Thorne is editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Nursing Inquiry and served for a decade as associate editor for qualitative health research. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, the Canadian Academy of Health Science, and the Canadian Academy of Nursing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thorne.
Thank you so very much, Ivana and Karen. And I will just pop up my screen. It's wonderful to be here with you all and to have an opportunity to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart. And I have a lot to say, so I'll proceed forward. I do invite you to pose questions. It would be great if we have time for questions toward the end. But I want to acknowledge the sponsors and give great appreciation for the opportunity to be able to reach out in this particular way to all of you, wherever you are. I too would like to begin acknowledging the land I am sitting on today. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, who've been the traditional caretakers and knowledge keepers of this land since time immemorial. I want to begin as well by situating this conversation about data analysis in interpretive description within the context of what interpretive description represents. I have taken the view over these years of studying and wrestling with qualitative methods as they're taken up in our applied and practice disciplines. And although it sounds a bit simplistic, I really do feel that there's a significant difference between the use of methods that were designed in social science disciplines whose ultimate purpose is theorizing, and qualitative research as it's taken up in the hands of those whose ultimate purpose is doing something in the world. Those of us in nursing, in education, in other kinds of applied disciplines that exist for the purpose of a particular kind of action. And so while I realize that is somewhat simplistic division, and we could argue that one all day, I think it's important to, as a way of situating this conversation so that you understand that I'm talking about the idea of qualitative research being applied in the applied disciplines to do the work of those applied disciplines, to answer the questions of those applied disciplines. And the method is not an exclusive method that's radically different from all others, but it's really trying to describe that which makes qualitative research excellent when it really works for the knowledge purposes of the applied disciplines. So that's my starting point. And the nature of knowledge that you need in the applied disciplines, I'd argue, is quite a different form of knowledge than what you might need in the context of social science in general. It tends to be a kind of processual knowledge. It's an evolving knowledge. It's flexible and infinitely adaptive. We would not, in my discipline of nursing, assume that you could possibly create knowledge that would stand for 5 years or 10 years. We assume that in 5 years or 10 years from now, we will know more. Our knowledge will be more robust. We will be more capable of understanding things better. And so we situate our qualitative studies within the context of what we recognize as an evolving body of knowledge and trying to contribute the insights that we can generate into what's needed now to advance that forward. So it's a slightly different focus in what we think we're doing and the legacies we're trying to leave with our knowledge. Within this kind of research, we inherently need to respect both commonalities that we might find and diversities. And this becomes quite important in that we might study something not to understand simply what's common among people having a different, the same disease or undergoing a certain kind of intervention or living with a certain kind of social complexity. We not only want to understand what would be common among them, but we want to be able to think about differences, because in the practice world, excellence always implies one's capacity with being able to spot the variations and understand what to do about them. So the nature of knowledge we would need in that context must include both. So interpretive description really is trying to draw inspiration from the applied disciplinary epistemology, that intellectual structure that sits behind our applied disciplines, that robust intellectual structure, the way in which a counseling therapist thinks, the way in which a social worker thinks, for example, rather than necessarily focusing on the relevance of borrowed theory. There may be relevant theories to draw upon along the way, but the taking up of theoretical frameworks and working with theoretical frameworks is not our primary purpose. In the applied and practice world, I'd argue that we're always moving beyond description and into interpretation. In my discipline of nursing, I can't simply describe what I've seen in the field because the audience is hungry for, and so what? What am I to be doing with that information? So the direction of my knowledge generation will always be moving into recognizing that interpretive audience that is seeking the what sense do I make of this and why does it matter? It's encouraging us to think about the universe of possible qualitative data sources and inquiry approaches. How we gather data and what data we gather is dependent on the questions we're asking. It's not necessarily a methodological question. It assumes that we may be able to come up with all kinds of new and different things to study and ways to gain insight about relevant questions of our applied and practice disciplines. And it's intended to build the idea of knowledge translation, knowledge uptake, knowledge mobilization, implementation science, if you will, into the initial design logic. We ask our questions and we conduct our studies with a full knowledge of who's out there needing that knowledge. You know, who are those disciplinary actors, or who are the people in the field that I have as my concern. And so the design decisions are based far less on a methodological textbook than they are on that deep knowledge of what it is the discipline needs to know and in what form. You'll all be aware that the world is full of guides on how to do qualitative data analysis. There are loads and loads of textbooks. There's loads of articles. There's huge numbers of resources as to how to analyze qualitative data. And in all of these texts and resources, there will be useful insights. I encourage you to scan them and go through them. However, I think that it is fair to say that the majority of them will have taken up the idea of analysis as it was originally conventionally understood for the purposes of the social sciences. And so the techniques that one can use are often guided toward an explicit understanding that one is aiming to for a product that will be theorizing, as opposed to the knowledge forms that we might need in the applied and practice disciplines. So great insights and great techniques, but I'm trying to argue that we would take it up in a different way in interpretive description. And that's why it's useful to have this time to have a conversation about qualitative data analysis. So don't ignore those resources, but also sometimes it's helpful not to take them as a literal guide. Now, qualitative data analysis is essentially a very simple operation. If you think about it, it's noticing things, collecting things, thinking about things, and then noticing more things in an iterative movement in and out. So it is a simple thing. We all do this kind of thinking regularly in our applied and practice disciplines. It's part of what we do, what's built into our DNA as practitioners or people engaged in the world. But we do it regularly, but we also don't always take the time to think about how we're doing it, and we don't take the time to think about how to control it and manage it so that it takes us forward in another direction. Another point I want to make is that qualitative data analysis does not just happen on its own. And if you read brief manuscript reports of qualitative research, you can often see language like themes emerged from the data. As if you went to sleep and by some alchemy, some magician came and stirred it all up and the themes became available. There's nothing passive about qualitative data analysis. It is the active intellectual work of the scholar engaging with, wrestling with, trying to figure out, sorting and organizing and managing data in many different ways. So try and stay away from passive language like this, because frankly, themes do not emerge, ideas do not emerge. It's the hard work that you do. And I'll try and talk you through that a little bit. Another starting point, we all understand that there's a distinction between inductive and deductive reasoning processes as we engage in analysis. And sometimes we would argue that quantitative research uses a deductive logic, qualitative research uses an inductive logic, and to a great extent that is true, but I'd also argue that we tend to move back and forth between inductive and deductive ways of thinking, going from general to specific and specific to general as we work a data set. So yes, we're trying to aim to push ourselves into that inductive domain in which we work from the observations and build up theorizing, but both are actually operating in the mind of the qualitative researcher. Another aspect of analysis that you'll, I'm sure, be very familiar with is the idea of coding. And many of the guides that you might follow on qualitative data analysis focus a great deal on coding, as if coding is the entire answer, and if you can get your coding right and work your coding through all of the various levels, that will be the way in which you develop a theory. And this coding guidance is very, very useful, purpose-driven, if you are actually building a comprehensive and big theory about something. If the purpose of your qualitative research is in the theoretical domain and you are theory building, then coding may be a very useful technique to get there. But I think that the over-attention to coding is something that very often stops qualitative researchers from doing their own thinking. And so I'm going to push back against that a little bit in the way I describe data analysis today. I think of coding, if we do it and when we do it, as simply a technique to help us organize material. We attach a signifier to something so that we can find it again, so that we can bring it together with another like object in our data set. We can think about them together and start to compare pieces. We can group things together and reflect on them, so that its best use in qualitative data analysis in the applied domain is to remember that it's simply a technique for organizing and signifying, and that we can do that in our own minds in many ways without the formal coding. And sometimes if we get caught up in the formal coding, it can really distract us from the larger intellectual purpose that we're aiming for. The idea of constant comparative analysis, which you may associate with grounded theory most particularly, is very much what is going on in the mind of any qualitative researcher. Seeing what you see and comparing it against all of the other things. And as we compare, we don't simply say this is like this or this is different than this. We ask those questions. And so what? What else can I think about this? What meaning can I take from that? So the idea of constant comparative analysis is one that I think that we can take with us and use as a terminology for the kind of thinking that we'll be doing. A distinction that I would draw with what I would consider conventional qualitative research versus the kind that I'm thinking of as applicable to the knowledge needs of the applied and practice disciplines is how we think about the purpose of analysis of a qualitative data set. And you will find as a subtext of many of those guides, an assumption that the purpose of data analysis in the qualitative domain is to conceptualize an entire data set, to take an entire data set, all of the observations you've made, all of the interviews you've done, and to try and conceptualize the whole. And I think that if you recognize that that's where many of the analysis guides are taking you, you will also see that conceptualizing a whole data set isn't necessarily what we're doing in the applied world. Another direction they may take you is to organize according to a predetermined theoretical framework. Many methods will call on you to identify a theoretical framework at the beginning and then encourage you to organize your data as you collect it into that framework. And so those two are meta-motivations, shall we say, of many of the conventional analysis techniques that you'll encounter. What I think we're doing in the applied disciplines, however, is not either of those. Primarily, it's extracting from our data set what can be learned about a phenomenon for a particular purpose. We've created a research question that focuses our attention on new learning, new insights that can be extracted, new ways of thinking about things, and we have an audience at the end of it. We understand who we are developing this knowledge for, what problem exists in the world that we are trying to help fill or resolve. And so we are extracting what can be learned, not summarizing the whole, and we are building a case for a new way of thinking about a phenomenon, a way of thinking about it that is richer or deeper or more complex or more beautiful or more robust. And it's those motivations that are profoundly influential in the way in which we think about what we're doing and why we're doing it in data analysis. We're moving beyond those recipes of coding and identification of themes and patterns and categories and the taxonomies of findings into trying to create knowledge that's meaningful. And you will see that profound effect of the coding and themes and patterns and categories in many, many published qualitative research reports. As a journal editor, I see so many in which people say, here are my findings. I found 14 themes. And then we enumerate them all. And that is not a finding. That's the homework that you did in order to work your data to try and find findings. It's the taxonomy of something as opposed to the insight, the finding, the thing I found out by engaging in this research. Here's how I think about what we're doing in data analysis. We're first of all saying, what's knowable in this context? What can I know from this data set that I've been able to create or that I am in the process of building? And how can I move beyond the self-evident? In the applied and practice disciplines, we never enter research without fully understanding what is it that my discipline already knows about this phenomenon. We understand what is explaining and driving action in clinical practice or applied practice at this moment, and what does the literature say. So we'd have a pretty solid grounding on what are the ideas that people are already taking into the field when they go and do this work. What are they thinking? What do they understand? And I want to move beyond that self-evident in my qualitative study. I don't need to restate that. I want to be able to move beyond that. And so what I need to do is engage the intellectual mechanism of interpretation and then try and envision that research product to move those mechanisms of interpretation into a form that can speak to the need that created the study in the first place. And that, I think, is probably a better way of describing the directionality that I'm taking in qualitative data analysis. So the work of analysis is essentially trying to understand why you're doing what you're doing, to differentiate the technical processes that you may engage in, and there are many interesting technical processes you might want to try out, from the intellectual processes. The technical processes in themselves will not create findings. They're tools to help you with the intellectual processes of creating findings. To be able to really capitalize on the insights you gain along the way, to check the credibility of those insights and interpretations, and to really continually reflect on what might this mean and why might it matter. So those are the thoughts that are driving you in this process. I want to draw the analogy of a deck of cards, because we all know the deck of cards, 52 different cards divided into 4 suits, and each one's different. It's probably a familiar collection to all of you, although you've had very different lives. But we know it exists, and it's a collection of things, analogous to a collection of things in your data set. And we might ask ourselves, what's the right way to organize this deck of cards? How should we be organizing and sorting and managing it? Well, the deck of cards has pretty well the same ingredients wherever you are in the world. It may or may not have jokers, but other than that, it's got the suits and the numbers. This basic display in which I lay it all out in some kind of sequential order isn't really doing anything or telling me about it. That would be a way of showing the whole deck. But depending on what game we are playing, depending on why we are taking out that deck of cards, we will want to organize and sort it in very different ways. If you're playing bridge, you might organize it in a certain way. If you're playing cribbage, if you're playing gin rummy, whatever your tradition and background is and however you think about cards, you will be organizing and sorting it in different ways because your organization is toward your purpose. You are understanding the purpose for which you are working that deck and moving quickly into an organizational structure that works toward that purpose. And it may be very different between you in the various things that you're doing with that deck of cards. And you may definitely find you don't need the whole deck of cards. It's a subset of the cards you're really interested in. Or you may even find that you want to move beyond the self-evident flat ordering of those decks of cards and to start to play with different ways in which you might arrange and sequence them. In this context, it doesn't matter what's on the face of the card. The analyst has moved into thinking about the shape of that card to be able to say, what else can I see here? What else can I create here? And I think this really does work as a metaphor for how we're taking a data set and how we're allowing ourselves to look at it in many different ways and to reflect continuously on what our purpose might be in working that deck of cards. So as we approach a data set and data analysis, we're not simply saying, we're not using as our guiding light what's in that data set. How can I display it in its fulsome on the table? We're really focused on why am I here and what am I doing? The guiding light through the process will be two things. One, the research question. Why am I asking something? What am I asking and why? And our intended audience. What does that intended audience need to know? And those two ideas will guide us. We return to them again and again as we reflect on the data set. They provide that orientation to what am I seeing here and why is this important? So on to a little bit of what we might do in working our data set and getting those inductive juices going. Many people, even those who live on devices all the time, find that there's something visceral about working with a page, working with a pencil, colors, highlighting, marginal notes. Some people find that they work with text and others with ideas, bubbles and arrows and concept maps. And we're all different. All of our minds work differently. The way in which we can trigger our minds will be different, some text-based, some more arts-based, but we're trying to get those inductive juices going. And rather than formal coding, in this example, you're seeing questions being posed in marginal notes, things being highlighted, a note being made that something might be relevant, but questions being asked, ideas being proposed, very vague and stimulating thinking. And that kind of mechanism, whether it's done on a physical page, whether it's done in text online, is all intended to get that thinking going. Some of you will find that you're much more comfortable with concept maps and diagrams that have bubbles and arrows, but that blank page, that starting with a blank page, coming at it again day after day in a different way to say, now what am I seeing in this? What organizational structure, what kinds of ideas have earned their way in? I know I'm not going to be able to get to the end of this study if this is not within the findings. And trying to think about what else can I do to try and stimulate this. I might start with my text and then work into diagrams like this, and I might start a new page on a new day saying, what else, if I don't do it this way, if I don't think about these ideas as being important, what other ideas might work? These are examples from graduate students that I have had the privilege of working with, showing just very different ways that people come up with mechanisms to work with ideas as they're analyzing their data. And this is somebody who's obviously working on computers, on a computer-based thing, drawing arrows and bubbles and putting things into maps, and then working with pencil to challenge it and defend it and describe it and argue why it does or doesn't work. And that this model, as it works through different iterations over time and is defended over time, gradually moves itself into, on the lower right, a visual that begins to give that individual shape for actually writing up findings. There's another example. This from a group of colleagues I had the privilege of visiting in Hong Kong, who probably showed me their board in which they're moving around yellow stickies, and the yellow stickies have little pieces of text attached so that they can continually think and revise their thinking and organize and sort their information. And each of you, as you talk to your colleagues, you find out how they do it, you read text and read suggestions in the literature, you may find that as you develop your skills as a data analyst, that certain ways tend to become familiar. They tend to work well because they actually stimulate those intellectual juices that get you starting to see pattern and starting to recognize the kinds of pattern that might be relevant for your questions. There is certainly a contribution to software, and I'd say in some smaller studies that we do in the applied and practice world, that contribution can be a little bit limited. And the thing to remember is that software does not do the thinking. It is not the analyst. It's an organizing tool. It's a very sophisticated and interesting organizing tool that can be very helpful to you. In a larger study in which you have, lots and lots of data and are going to be working it over time, it's something you probably will need. But in a smaller study, many people find that they can do just as much organizing in a Word document, word processing document, for example, and that the hazard with software can be investing such a lot of time in learning the program, inputting the material, and then coding, because software and coding are often very closely connected, that they can sometimes lose the enthusiasm for getting those inductive juices going. So I encourage you to consider, critically reflect on the way in which software will or will not be relevant to your study, and to just make sure that the software doesn't take over the study, but that if you're using it to stimulate those inductive juices. I also want to comment on thematic analysis, because it's a term that's used across many methods of research as a thing that the data analysis is doing. And to some extent, we're all doing some kinds of thematic analysis, whatever, anytime we're doing qualitative research. But thematic analysis itself really is a fairly simplistic process. And this little graph will make it quite clear that all of the steps of that thematic analysis that may seem, easy to take up and helpful, really are only trying to help you define and name themes. And somehow that becomes the essence within which you'll be able to produce the report. I think that too is, yes, it's a part of it, but it's too simplistic to say that simply finding themes and defining those themes will make a qualitative report the one that people will remember, the one that will meet the need for the knowledge that people have in your applied and practice discipline. Instead, I really would encourage you to think hard and to focus your attention on what similarities and differences you can see between various cases, between various interviews that you've had, between various observations you've had, whatever modality, whatever form of data you're using. And in the applied and practice world, it's almost always the case that you need to ask yourself, what did we find that was expected? What do people already know? And therefore, yes, we found it in the data set, but we don't need to report it. Or maybe we only need to report it in a sentence and say, as expected, people told us X and X and X. But the finding is not the thing we expected based on literature and current wisdom and practice. The finding is what else is there. So we want to be able to focus, put that what we expected to the side and say, okay, what's unexpected or what's slightly different than I might have expected? What can I possibly see in a new way or a richer way or a more robust way? What common ideas come up in all or most cases? And what sorts of things occur occasionally? And what sense do I make of that? And we're moving all of that inquiry, the things we're asking ourselves as we work our data, into what story is emerging from this data set, from these accounts, from these observations that needs telling. What story is emerging that needs telling? Another visual example of another wonderful doctoral student working with a data set, moving ideas into larger and smaller circles, figuring out which things become more central, which kinds of ideas stay on the side. You can see in this a combination of sort of the visual and the text starting to emerge as people work with and make new ones and try it again and try it differently organized. And this beginning kind of organizing structure, moving itself over time into a more coherent organization that will begin to shape the written findings at the time that they are ready to write. Another visual example of somebody putting a model on the computer and then going at it to sort of try and explain what it means and undoing it and wrestling with it. Is this too simplistic? What am I trying to say here? What's really important? And we keep working these techniques, whatever works for us, whether it's yellow stickies on the wall or recipe cards on the floor or working text, making notes, to confirm the bases on which we're beginning to form interpretations, to begin to expand on those associations. We want to test out those relationships. And in the applied and practice world, we also capitalize on outliers. We've got the advantage of knowing not simply what's in our data set, the 12 people I might have interviewed for my small study, but I've got the opportunity of knowing the 500 or 1,000 that I will have encountered in practice. And so we can ask ourselves what's in our data set, but also what's missing. What might have been there? What do I need to keep in mind that might have been there, but doesn't happen to be in my data set? And we can engage the critic. What's the relationship between this data set and the larger question that I'm asking? As we move forward, I think that my meta message is to pay attention to the storyline that you're developing, that the techniques you choose to take up are those that are moving you toward being able to build that story that can be told to your applied and practice discipline. And while they may all be helpful, don't let them become distractors. These codings, the software, and the stepwise guides. They're all out there, they're all useful, and they will inspire you in different ways, and perhaps in different ways at different points in your qualitative research career. Some of them may want to cling to because they seem to be an anchor to hang on to at the beginning, and others may inspire you to think differently as you move forward over time. But they can really become distractors. They can draw all of your energy and attention so that you are serving them as opposed to using them to serve your purpose of building that storyline. So keep that storyline in mind and allow the software, the coding systems, and the stepwise guides to be interesting ideas to draw upon, but not the reason for doing this work. As you continue to move forward, you want to be able to figure out what's there in the literature, what commonalities actually matter, what kinds of insights might expand on what people in the field already know, what's actually relevant to the applied and practice world. So these are the kinds of questions that you can ask to move yourself in that direction. And as I said earlier, explicitly emphasizing those diversities. What do those diversities tell you about the phenomenon in the real world? What insights could you draw from those diversities about the possible diversity of real practice? An excellent practitioner in my discipline and likely in yours is not one that only knows how to take care of the standardized patient. The excellent practitioner is the one who is most easily able to spot that individual who might be deserved if they were treated as a standardized patient, that person who might need a little extra of this or a little extra of that. So excellence involves being able to work with diversities and our research products toward applied and practice excellence need to move us in that direction as well. Be mindful of that as well. So what's within your data set that might help us start to see what those diversities look like? We're not trying to capture all of them. We know we can't. Diversities are theoretically infinite, but what kinds of insights can we pull from a data set that point us in that direction so that our findings can do justice to that idea too? In the end, although some of you may showcase and mobilize and animate your research with all kinds of creative and arts-based projects and all kinds of wonderful things, most of us do need to focus on a written report, a written publication. And even if we don't, I would argue that the work of writing is very much a part of being able to understand what you think and what you see, being able to measure how your thinking is evolving. And so the findings, as you move from thinking to actually creating a product, take the form of a table of contents. A table of contents is a really useful device to organize yourself into what are my major groupings and what sequence do they go in, and what are the minor groupings and what sequence do they go in, and how do I think of them as a whole? How do I organize and sequence them so that in some ways they build up the story that I am trying to build? They demonstrate a beginning and a middle and an end, and there are natural steps. There are ways of lining them up and sequencing them so that I can build on that argument to create that most powerful endpoint that I'm trying to aim for. And to be thinking about things like syntax and structure, thinking about the linkage and the transitions. And the table of contents becomes an extremely useful device to do that. Often a table of contents, when you first start one, is very awkward and difficult, and you can't quite see where it's heading. It doesn't yet tell the story. But over time, it evolves. By working that table of contents, you can start to move yourself toward a structure that will allow that story to be told. This is an example from a graduate student who was working with younger women with a very severe and sudden cardiac condition, one that was not well understood in the healthcare system. So she was able to move beyond a very chronological sequence of how people told their story into conceptually, what is it that clinicians need to understand are the profound emotional and psychological challenges that these individuals are having to work through, and therefore how do I need to be vigilant to and understand what their needs will be. And so the moving of the table of contents was a way of being able to see how those ideas could shift from what would have been a technical listing of different bits of data and observations that had come to her into structure that allowed her to tell that story in a way that profoundly depicted the pain and the distress that these individuals are going through. As we're writing up findings, it's important always to be thinking about our job as creating that coherent narrative. The findings should not be an itemized collection of things, 5 themes, 10 categories, and they instead should take the form of a structure that allows us to build a coherent narrative that represents what we have found in a way that the idea can be built up by the audience, whether they're reading or listening to us, and understood in the most profound way possible. So there's a place we want to begin. There's things we need to say along the way, and then we get to the thing we're aiming at. Where does it end? And in the writing, I encourage us to think about writing in three different voices. There's elements to that voice. There's a narrative depiction of the ideas, the things that were observed, the things that were heard. There's also illustrative material, whether it be verbatim quotations or descriptions of observations or paraphrasing of what you think you heard. And then there's interpretive commentary that explains what this might mean. And as a beginning researcher, you may find you need to write the narrative first to get those linkages clear, and then secondly, build in the appropriate quotes and exemplars that earn their way in, that will best communicate to the reader what you are arguing. And then as a third step, allow yourself to comment on what this means. The reason I point to this is that I think there's such a temptation when you get attached to your data, and especially if you're organizing it in such a way that it's data excerpts that become the organizing structure, there's such a temptation to simply line them all up and expect the illustrative material to tell the story itself. But it's you, the scholar, the researcher, the inquirer, the person who came in with that curiosity to the benefit of your discipline, who has the narrative to tell, and you want to control the narrative, and you want to be very critically reflective on which are the exemplars that you will bring in to illustrate that, to bring it to life to your audience. Along the way of data analysis, you want to avoid some obvious hazards. There's a lot, but these are a few. One, premature closure. We're all eager to get to findings, and simply reorganizing things into themes can cause you to feel like I've hit it, I've hit the end. And yet reporting the themes that you saw is almost a technical exercise, and it probably is not going to produce the kinds of findings that really excite the imagination of your intended audience. You're also wanting to avoid misrepresenting frequency. Just because you heard something often does not mean it's important. It may be something that was self-evident. You're focusing on what can be learned. And you don't want to over-inscribe yourself. You're the tool of the instrument of the research for sure, and you've gone through a powerful experience in engaging in a qualitative study, but it isn't about you. It's about you learning something on behalf of your discipline. You want to be sure that you formulate your findings into a manner that's going to be understandable within your discipline. Theatrical forms and all kinds of artistic forms are great, and they may be a useful adjunct to the work, but often the written report and the presentation at the conference, although they seem old-fashioned and mundane, may be some of the best ways in which your audiences can receive it. And you need to be mindful of what's in their thoughts. Are they a scientific community that is concerned with a hierarchy of evidence and will see a qualitative study as simply very low on this pyramid of evidence? You need to think about who are they and what ingredients of this reporting structure will be required before they understand how to take up the findings that I have. So the aim of this kind of research is to really allow you to take up that disciplinary force structure, the thing that your discipline knows, in deciding what's a relevant research question in the first place, and for whom am I generating knowledge, to justify this particular study at this point in time, and to understand the implications of all the steps you make in both data collection and analysis on the kinds of findings that you have, and to include the idea of the implications of those findings on practice insight. And sometimes the findings that you create won't be a new profound truth about anything, but they may be new important questions that we really should be asking that I would not have thought of before I engaged in this study. The issues of rigor and credibility, like all qualitative research, are important, But interpretive description, we articulate them because of this distinction in how we're thinking about the kind of research we're doing. We're thinking about different kinds of credibility and rigor measures, including, does it have an epistemological integrity? Does it align with the way my discipline thinks? Does it show a representative credibility? Do I speak intelligently about what can be learned from the subset of the universe that I've been able to capture? Have I shown my analytic logic? And when I interpret this, have I done that with an appropriate level of authority, given who I am and how I've engaged with this work? And in the context of our applied and practice disciplines, we are always also mindful of that social contract, which is an important part of credibility. The moral defensibility of what I'm doing and what interpretations I'm making of it, the disciplinary relevance, the pragmatic obligation, the reality that even if we don't know enough about something, our colleagues are doing that work every day. We are always working on the basis of the knowledge that we have. And the contextual awareness. Every context will be different. And so our understanding of the context of our studies and the context of the eventual audience is incredibly important to our capacity to credibly and intelligently argue what are the probable truths that we think we can glean from this work. So I think interpretive description really does add something to the methodological options, including the data analysis aspect. We can design studies that meet the knowledge needs of practice and applied disciplines, and we have the freedom to depart from the methodological rules that were invented for the intellectual projects of other disciplines. I'll stop there. Hopefully intrigued you about expanding and reflecting on your own data analysis, and hope that we have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thorne. Really, every time I hear you talk about your work, I learn something new, which I guess is good, right? So now I'm going to be monitoring the chat and waiting for your questions to come. And then I'll be combining questions that are similar or asking specifics. We have a question about depth. It says, do you have any guidance around depth for PhD student dissertations? How to answer those that say that, that something is enough for a dissertation? I think that's the gist of the question here.
Yeah, it's very hard with a qualitative study to say what's enough. But in the applied and practice disciplines, I think we can come to a decision as to whether you have learned enough to have anything relevant to say to the discipline. And so when you enter a study, you might think you're going to interview 20 people with a particular condition, or you're going to observe, 5 daycares for a certain phenomena. You might think that that would be the right number, but if in doing that you have nothing to say, you probably need to continue to go further, or you may need to sort of recalibrate the way in which you're thinking about the questions you're asking of the data set that you've got. I think it's possible with all good research questions that are articulated in the language of disciplinary knowledge, it's possible to create useful and meaningful findings from any qualitative study, even if it's simply being more informed about why it's important that we ask different questions or what new questions we might ask. So I think that the idea of depth, how much in a dissertation, is more of a cultural norm within the universities. How far do you need to have gone with something before you can demonstrate the ingredients of scholarship? I just remind us all that the world of research, including qualitative research, is orchestrated according to fairly artificial boundaries. the natural inclination of an applied and practice practitioner would be to be out there asking questions and gathering data for the whole of their life and just refining their questions and gathering more data. And, you know, it's a lifelong detective work, but we need to break it into parcels and parts. We need to report it in individual papers. We need to propose a dissertation or propose a funded project. But the work is not in parts. That's the artificial structure. So I think the only answer is to think about, have you got enough to say something relevant and meaningful? And, you know, in the context that you're doing your research, if it's a dissertation or a thesis, for example, have you demonstrated enough to be able to show that you can do this work?
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question about whether you'd say some more about the difference between themes and findings.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the literature that focuses on distinguishing between a theme and a category and a grouping, and it is organizing your thinking toward those organizing structures. A theme, the idea is drawn from music, in which there will be a certain refrain that repeats and makes coherent a collection of pieces of music over time, for example. And so when people talk about an overarching theme, they're talking about something that makes that coherence of a whole, that repeats or draws through a set. They may also be talking about sub-themes or themes within or categories. And having read and critically reflected on this literature for most of my scholarly life, I don't think there is any clear definitional distinction, and that different authors use language of categories and themes interchangeably. But what they're talking about is organizing structures. And I do think everybody needs an organizing structure, but that you don't want to think that the organizing structure and finding an organizing structure is the goal of research. It's simply a tool. And try one organizing structure, try another organizing structure. Organizing structures and finding an organizing structure is just the homework you're doing in order to massage your thinking and to come up with different ways of working that data set.
Thank you very much. I'm going to combine two questions now. One asked about how to move beyond just the recipes to a more deep and useful understanding of the data. And the second one is about the difference between qualitative description and interpretive description.
Yeah, they're different questions. The deepening, I think that the deepening is ongoing work to reflect on what am I saying now, and what else could I do? How else could I reconstruct this? And what I find often is if someone, a beginning researcher, is able to come up with one organizing structure, and you say, okay, put that one away as if it doesn't work. Now create an entirely alternative organizing structure. And argue that one. Tell me what the story would look like if we organized it this way, what the story would look like if we organized it this way, and then maybe even a third. And it's only when you can fully own, why is this the structure that best answers my research question for my intended audience? When I own the justification of why that's the case, then I can write it. Now, I believe that qualitative description, particularly as Marty Sandalowski wrote about it, is very much in the same direction that I was taking interpretive description. It was a way of saying, why do we have to name our qualitative method in a formal theoretical convention? Why don't we have a thing that's simply calling itself qualitative description? That was the argument she was making. In using the language of interpretive description, I'm explicitly suggesting that people in the applied and practice disciplines cannot really tolerate pure description alone. What sense do I make of this and how do I interpret it is just part of a, it's in the DNA, and it will occur. So that we were both, and others as well, many others in the applied and practice research, qualitative research domain, have been really trying to just give guidance to people to say, you don't need to hang your hat on a specific methodological tradition. You don't have to say, I am doing narrative inquiry, I am doing grounded theory. We can draw technique. There's great technique in all of that marvelous literature, but we can actually design studies that are purpose-driven for our applied and practice disciplinary knowledge. And so in doing that, we don't need to use the language that will then imply a rule set, and we can make those design logic decisions that best serve the needs of the questions that we're asking.
Great. Thank you so much. I think your contribution in qualitative research has been phenomenal. And especially for those of us in nursing, it's been really helpful to be allowed to grow our research within a tradition that understands our discipline. So thank you very much. I just want to, oh, sorry, that's the puppy. I'm trying to keep him quiet by feeding him treats all the time.
I see a question. Would you mind if I just quickly respond to the question that just popped up on saturation? That's a great bugaboo, and
yes, sure.
And one that's an example of a methodological rule that makes very good sense in the theory building kind of qualitative research. You can't, if you haven't got all parts of the theory covered, for example, you can't be commenting on the whole. And so saturation is an idea that makes very good sense in the context of some things. It makes very little sense. It makes no sense, I would say, in the context of research in my field. It would be intellectually incorrect for somebody who's a nurse studying patients with a particular phenomenon to say, I've interviewed 20 people and therefore I started to see a lot of redundancies and therefore I can assume I've saturated the findings. Someone in my discipline ought to be saying, I imagine that if I continued to interview thousands, over time I would continue to see those new variations. And as I became more aware and insightful, I might spot them. If I was only looking at commonalities, I might ignore them. So we've been using the language that Malterud and her crew in Norway created that had to do with information power, which is much more useful. Have I got enough to be able to say something intelligent to my discipline is a more useful way to say I can exit data. So saturation, which turns up in a lot of the journal, reviewers will be asked to comment on it. You see it written quite often, but I think very often it's a hollow trope. People include it in a qualitative research report. I reach saturation after 20, and I think they're not. It's disingenuous in the context of many applied and practice studies to be able to say anything about saturation. It isn't a relevant concept and it doesn't exist in that way. So thanks so much for raising that question, because it's the perfect example of a methodological rule that where it doesn't apply, we shouldn't have to try and force it to apply, and we shouldn't be writing our research reports with language that we can't stand up for.
Thank you very much. There are a few other questions that have come up. Ivana, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I can certainly stay if that's okay with both of you. Yes, happy to.
Okay, there is a question here about funding. It seems most funding does not support qual methods, and I guess the additional part of that would be, do you have any suggestions for people writing proposals for funding in which they plan to use interpretive description?
I've been a qualitative researcher for many years, and I do feel that the funding world is getting wiser about the value of qualitative research. Certainly in the health sphere, the patient-oriented knowledge and patient-reported outcomes and that kind of thing are driving that as well. I think that most of our communities have had to, as we've moved into trying to crack the funding categories, have had to work together to say, how do we constitute a proposal that will succeed in this domain? And I think that's one of the great things about having our international qualitative research communities, interdisciplinary, come together, because we can share that kind of insight. We can support one another, give one another feedback on proposals, that sort of thing. But I do think that there's some kinds of fundings in the social science world. You will do better if you name a social science method and describe a proposal that appears to adhere to its methodological rules. In the applied world, I believe that we're now in a place where articulating what you're doing and how it aligns with the overall arching question of your research is a much stronger argument. And to avoid people saying, but aren't you supposed to be doing saturation, for example, using the language of interpretive description to describe the work. You don't need to say I'm doing it, but to use it as a justification for those kinds of design decisions that make best sense. And I do find increasingly that people are able to fund, certainly in the health field, which I know best, but they're able to fund qualitative, large-scale qualitative studies or qualitative aspects to mixed method studies. And to my great delight, disciplines that I would never have thought of as seeing a value in qualitative research are starting to take up this challenge and see a way using interpretive description to be able to include some qualitative aspects to their larger investigations.
Thank you so much. I think we have more questions, but we'll make sure to copy them off and send them to you, Sally, so that you can respond in text. And that will be appended as a document, folks, in the to the recording, so you'll be able to see the answers. So please join me in thanking Dr. Thorne for a great presentation.
Thank you so much for this time.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Thorne. It was very insightful. There's a lot of comments in the chat. They loved the cards metaphor and a lot of other positive feedback. And thank you so much. It was great. Okay, so well, with that, then we've reached the end. So certainly we'll send an email with the link to watch the recording and more information. So we'll stay in touch, keep an eye out for it. And feel free to reach out to us if you ever have any other questions as well here at Atlas TI. If you ever want to learn about the software or how it can help with qualitative analysis, please count on our support. And you can always reach us by writing to training@atlasti.com, and we'd be happy to offer help or discounts as well. But more than anything, I just want to give our big thanks to Professor Karen Olson and then of course Dr. Thorne here today. And thank you all of you for your time here today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So goodbye everyone and take care.